She was 81 years old, and she had not spoken a coherent sentence in 4 days. The dementia had advanced slowly at first, then with a cruelty that her family had not anticipated. By the final week, she no longer recognized her daughter's face. She could not recall her husband's name, though they had been married for 53 years. The nurses described her as absent, present in the room but unreachable, as though something essential had already withdrawn. Then, 2 days before she died, she sat up. Her eyes opened with a clarity her daughter had not seen in months. She looked toward the corner of the room, not at the ceiling, not at the window, but at a specific point near the wall, with the focused attention of someone watching a person approach. She smiled, and then she said a name, the name of her brother, a brother who had died 11 years earlier. She was not confused, she was not distressed. She was, by every account from everyone in that room, unmistakably happy to see someone. She died 38 hours later, still calm, still without fear. Her daughter has spent years trying to understand what her mother saw in that corner of the room, not because she is certain of the answer, but because she cannot let go of the question. And she is not alone. Across hospitals, hospices, and private homes, across continents, across centuries, across profoundly different religious traditions and cultural backgrounds, dying people have reported the same experience with a consistency that researchers have found impossible to ignore. They see the dead, not strangers, not frightening figures, not demons or angels in the way religious art imagines them. They see, with apparent recognition and apparent joy, the specific faces of people they loved who are no longer alive. The experience has names: deathbed visions, end-of-life experiences, pre-death phenomena. It has been documented in medical literature going back more than a century. It has been reported in cultures as different as rural Japan, urban America, indigenous communities in Brazil, and villages in northern India. It appears in the accounts of people who held deep religious faith and in the accounts of people who believed in nothing beyond the material world. And there is something specific about these visions that has made them genuinely difficult to explain. The dying do not typically see living people, they see the dead. That pattern, quiet, consistent, cross-cultural, is where the real mystery begins. Before exploring what researchers have found, it is worth understanding what these experiences actually look and feel like from the inside, because the clinical language can strip them of something important. William Barrett was a physicist and professor at the Royal College of Science in Dublin. In 1924, he published a book called Deathbed Visions, based on accounts he had gathered over many years. One of the cases that affected him most came from his own wife, a surgeon who had been present at the death of a young woman named Doris. Doris had just given birth. The delivery had gone badly, and it became clear that she would not survive. As she was dying, she began to describe seeing her father, who had died some years earlier. She was calm and appeared genuinely pleased. Then, according to the account recorded by Barrett's wife, Doris's expression changed. She appeared puzzled. She said she could see her sister Vida. The difficulty was this: Doris did not know that Vida had died. Vida had passed away 3 weeks earlier. The family had deliberately concealed the news from Doris during her difficult pregnancy, not wanting to cause her additional distress. Doris could not have known her sister was dead, and yet she reported seeing her. Barrett documented the case in careful detail. He was not a credulous man, he was a scientist, and he found the case profoundly unsettling, not because he was certain of what it meant, but because he could not identify a satisfying, ordinary explanation. Critics have pointed out reasonably that a single case documented nearly a century ago proves very little. Memory is unreliable. Accounts are filtered through grief and wish, and the absence of a known explanation does not confirm a supernatural one. These are legitimate concerns, and they deserve to be taken seriously. But Barrett's case is not alone. Across the 20th century and into the 21st, researchers returned to this phenomenon repeatedly, and what they found complicated the easy dismissals. In the 1960s and 1970s, Karlis Osis, a psychologist working with the American Society for Psychical Research, conducted what became one of the most extensive, systematic surveys of deathbed visions ever attempted. He and his colleague Erlendur Haraldsson gathered data from thousands of physicians and nurses across the United States and India. They were looking for patterns. They found them. Across cultures separated by geography, language, religion, and worldview, the dying were reporting experiences with striking structural similarities. They were seeing deceased relatives. They were describing elevated emotional states, peace, joy, apparent recognition. They were, in many cases, becoming less frightened. But one finding from Osis and Haraldsson's research demanded particular attention. Medication did not appear to be the determining factor. Patients who were heavily sedated were no more likely to report visions than those who were not. Patients with high fevers, who might be expected to hallucinate more frequently, did not report significantly more visions. The presence or absence of brain-affecting drugs showed a weaker correlation with deathbed visions than researchers had anticipated. That did not prove the visions were real in any metaphysical sense, but it made the most immediate dismissal that it was simply drugs or fever distorting a dying brain, harder to sustain without qualification. More recent research has examined the phenomenon through a different lens, and what it has found is, in some ways, more humanly striking than any statistical correlation. Christopher Kerr is a physician and the chief medical officer at Hospice Buffalo in New York. Over many years working with dying patients, Kerr became increasingly struck by something his patients were telling him, not occasionally, but regularly. He began to document it systematically. In a study published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine in 2014, Kerr and his colleagues surveyed 66 patients in the final weeks and days of their lives. They asked about dreams and visions. They listened without judgment. 88% of participants reported at least one significant end-of-life experience. The most common involved deceased relatives. The vast majority described these experiences as comforting rather than disturbing, and something remarkable emerged from the longitudinal dimension of the study. As death approached, the experiences became more frequent, more vivid, and more dominated by the presence of people who had already died. Kerr has been careful about what he claims these experiences prove. He does not use them to argue for any particular metaphysical conclusion, but he has said consistently that dismissing them as hallucinations or dying brain noise fails his patients because the experiences are meaningful to them, and because the consistent features of these experiences across patients who did not know each other, who had never discussed such things, are not easily accounted for by chance alone. There is one detail from this research that stops many people who encounter it for the first time. The patients who had these experiences were, on average, less afraid to die. Not because someone reassured them, not because they received different medication, but because of what they saw, or believed they saw, in the days before the end. At this point, an intelligent observer will raise the question that must be raised. Is there any explanation for deathbed visions that does not require anything beyond ordinary neuroscience and psychology? The answer is yes, several have been proposed, and they deserve honest consideration. The most common explanation is that deathbed visions are a form of hallucination produced by a dying brain. As the brain is deprived of oxygen, as neurotransmitter systems begin to fail, as physiological stress reaches its final stages, the mind may produce vivid and emotionally charged imagery. The content of that imagery, deceased loved ones, peaceful environments, may simply reflect the dying person's deepest wishes and memories. This is a coherent hypothesis. It is not unreasonable. A related explanation draws on the concept of expectation. Dying people, and the people around them, may unconsciously expect certain experiences, and those expectations could shape what is reported. Cultural narratives about death, absorbed across a lifetime from religion, family, tradition, might influence the content of final visions. Another possibility is memory consolidation. In states of extreme physiological stress, the brain may prioritize emotionally significant memories. The faces of lost loved ones, being among the most emotionally weighted memories a person carries, might surface with unusual intensity and vividness. These are serious proposals. They are not absurd. Any honest investigation must include them. But here is what makes this phenomenon genuinely difficult to settle. If deathbed visions were simply wish fulfillment hallucinations, we would expect the dying to see whoever they most wished to see, which would frequently include living people. Close friends still alive, spouses who survived them, children, parents who were still living. But the research consistently suggests that what the dying see is significantly skewed toward the dead. Not in every case, but in a pattern strong enough that Osis and Haraldson noted it explicitly as one of their most puzzling findings. And that pattern does not map neatly onto the wish fulfillment model. The most natural candidate for a wish fulfillment hallucination, a child imagining their living mother, is not what the data shows most often. The expectation model runs into a similar difficulty. It might explain why religious imagery appears across cultures. It does not easily explain why a dying woman would report seeing her sister, a sister whose death she did not know had occurred. The mystery does not resolve cleanly in either direction. There is another dimension of deathbed visions that is rarely discussed in popular accounts, and it is perhaps the most humanly important one. What does the experience do to the person who witnesses it? Not the dying person, the person who is present. Families who sit with dying loved ones and watch them respond to something invisible, something in the room that no one else can perceive, describe those moments in remarkably consistent terms. Bewilderment, yes. Sometimes fear initially, but then very often something else. Peace. The dying person's distress, which can be profound in the hours before death, frequently diminishes during these experiences. The body that was restless becomes still. The person who was frightened begins to look, by all observable measures, comforted. One nurse who has worked in palliative care for more than 2 decades described it in an interview that has been cited in multiple published accounts of this research. She said that she had watched hundreds of people die, and that the ones who had these visions, who seemed to see and respond to something invisible, died differently, more quietly, with less apparent struggle. She was not claiming to know what they were seeing. She was describing what she observed, and what she observed was that they were not alone, or did not appear to believe they were alone, in their final hours. That distinction matters. It matters clinically, because fear and agitation at the end of life cause measurable suffering. And it matters in a way that science cannot fully quantify, but that anyone who has sat with a dying person will understand immediately. The quality of a death is not nothing. In 2010, a researcher named Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist affiliated with King's College London, published a study examining end-of-life experiences in palliative care patients across the United Kingdom. Fenwick had spent decades studying consciousness and its relationship to the brain, and he approached this subject with the skepticism appropriate to his training. What he found confirmed many of the patterns that earlier researchers had identified. Deceased relatives, calm emotional states, reduction in fear, visions that became more frequent as death approached. But Fenwick's work also drew attention to something that had been noted anecdotally for years. In some cases, people other than the dying patient reported shared perceptions. Family members present at a death sometimes described unusual experiences of their own, a sense of presence, a perceptible change in the atmosphere of the room, occasional visual or auditory phenomena that multiple people reported simultaneously. These accounts were rare in the broader data set, but they were not unique. They were reported across multiple studies, across multiple researchers, across different countries. Fenwick was careful not to overclaim. These accounts were subjective. They could not be independently verified. The methodological problems were substantial, but he noted that if a dying brain alone were generating these experiences purely from internal neurological noise, the presence of corresponding reports from fully healthy bystanders would require an additional explanation that the conventional model does not easily provide. He did not say this was proof of anything. He said it was a question that remained genuinely open. There is a case from the literature on this subject that is difficult to set aside once you have encountered it, because it resists easy categorization from any direction. A woman, documented in case studies from the research of Carla Wills Brandon, a therapist and researcher who has worked extensively in this area, was present at the death of her elderly mother. The mother had been deeply religious throughout her life, while the daughter described herself as a committed agnostic. They had rarely agreed on matters of faith. In the hours before the mother's death, she became calm in a way that had not characterized her final days. She looked toward the doorway of her room and appeared to be watching something approach. She reached out her hand. She said clearly and without confusion the name of her husband, a man who had died 12 years earlier. Then she died. The daughter, who had spent her adult life dismissing the idea of any afterlife, said afterward that she had found the experience impossible to categorize. She did not become religious. She did not claim she now knew what death held. But she said that the way her mother died, the recognition, the calm, the reaching, had permanently altered something in how she thought about the question. She said, "I don't know what she saw, but she saw something, and whatever it was not frightening. That is not evidence in any scientific sense, but it is testimony from a skeptic, and skeptical witnesses carry a particular kind of weight, not because they are more reliable than believers, but because they have less incentive to interpret ambiguous events in a comforting direction." So where does this leave us? Deathbed visions are not a fringe phenomenon found in isolated spiritual texts. They are documented across decades of systematic research conducted by credentialed researchers working within medical and psychological institutions. They appear across cultures too different to share a common narrative tradition for the specific patterns that emerge. They are reported by patients who are not heavily medicated, which makes the most direct pharmacological dismissal insufficient on its own. They cluster around deceased rather than living individuals, which makes simple wish fulfillment an incomplete explanation. And they have, in documented cases, been reported by people who did not know, could not have known, that the specific individual they were seeing was already dead. None of this resolves the deeper question. It would be dishonest to claim otherwise. The neurological explanation, that a dying brain under profound stress generates emotionally charged imagery drawn from memory, remains plausible and cannot be ruled out. The cultural expectation model explains some features, though not all. The possibility that these are genuine perceptions of something beyond ordinary physical reality cannot be scientifically confirmed and perhaps cannot be. What remains is something more fundamental than any single explanation. The dying, across all of human history, across every culture that has thought seriously about what death involves, have reported that they are not alone at the threshold. They have described faces they recognize. They have described calm. They have described with a consistency that defies easy dismissal, something that looks like welcome. Whether that welcome comes from inside the mind or from somewhere outside it, whether it is memory or perception, neurochemistry or something else entirely, is a question that current science cannot answer with certainty. But that question matters. It matters because it asks something fundamental about consciousness, whether it is entirely a product of the brain, ending completely when the brain fails, or whether it might be something that the brain merely channels and that continues in some form beyond the moment when the monitor goes quiet and the room goes still. The woman who sat up in her final hours and smiled at the corner of the room may have been seeing nothing, or she may have been seeing exactly what she believed she was seeing. Her daughter, who was present, says she does not know. She says she will probably never know. But she also says this: whatever her mother saw in that corner, it was enough. It was enough to take away the fear. It was enough to make her smile. It was enough to let her go. And perhaps, in the end, that is the detail that matters most. Not what the dying see, but what seeing it does to them. Because if dying people across the world, across every era of recorded human history, have been comforted at the threshold by faces they recognize and love, then whatever the explanation turns out to be, we are left with the same quiet, unsettling, and strangely beautiful question. What is waiting for us at the end? We don't know. But the people who have come closest to finding out seem, more often than not, to have found it worth smiling at.